Our guest today is Dr. William Choong, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, where he is Managing Editor of the Institute magazine, the Fulcrum. Dr. Choong's expertise involves territorial disputes in the Asia Pacific, in particular the East China Sea and South China Sea. He also studies major power relations in the Asia Pacific, including Southeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. Earlier in his career, Dr. Choong was senior writer for Singapore's main English language newspaper, the Straits Times, where he was responsible for opinion pieces and editorials, focusing on defense, diplomacy, and U.S. policy in Asia. I recommend following him on Twitter at WILLSCHOONG. I'm going to repeat that at sign WILLSCHOONG. I'm pleased to have Dr. Choong with us again today. Dr. Choong, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on your recording again. And sorry to keep you up so late, knowing that it's quite late in California at the moment.
No problem at all. It's always a thrill to speak with you. You have provided much thoughtful commentary about the effects in the Indo-Pacific of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Along these lines, while Ukraine is not a member of NATO, the U.S. deems Ukraine as a security interest, given that Washington and Ukraine, Washington and Kiev, they're sister democracies, and due to Ukraine's proximity to NATO countries. Uh, I know that many in the Indo Pacific are watching President Biden's response quite closely to see how he will handle this crisis. The U.S. is a treaty ally of many Pacific countries, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, and so forth. And also, the U.S. is regarded as the de facto security guarantor of Taiwan. So, my question is, what has been the assessment of America's allies and partners in the Pacific of President Biden's response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
Thanks, Ted. That's a great question to begin with. Just a caveat. I mean, from my vantage in Singapore, Singapore is a hub of Southeast Asia, if not the Indo-Pacific. But I don't think I can offer myself as a kind of a benchmark of Asia Pacific opinion. I can only offer my opinion, which is based on a study of the reactions that we've seen so far. Just to take us a step back, I think it's been about 8 months since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was a planned withdrawal. It was a deliberate withdrawal, and of course, the withdrawal of the US from Afghanistan, although it was planned and deliberate, it was watched with some concern in the Asia Pacific, if not Southeast Asia, because of that general theme about American credibility in terms of your security guarantees. That said, I would say that America was actually withdrawing from Afghanistan so that it can focus more of its bandwidth and its resources on the Indo-Pacific. So in a sense, it was a bonus for Southeast Asia and for the Indo-Pacific that America was actually planning to dedicate more of its resources and bandwidth to the region. When you talk about Ukraine, Ted, I think there are various layers that we have to pick off here. I think at the most basic layer is what Ukraine portends for the regional order and the international order that's based on the underpinnings of international law and sovereignty of states that has been established since 1945, with the UN Charter. So in that sense, at this level, I would say a lot of Asia Pacific countries are encouraged by Uncle Sam, by the United States taking a very strong position on Ukraine, and in alignment with the European Union and in alignment with many Asia Pacific countries like Republic of Korea and Japan, Singapore in many aspects. So I think in that sense, it's encouraging to see that the United States is engaged, very fully in the Ukraine conflict. The thing is, there's another layer here, and I think in most of the media commentary, there's a question about what whether what the United States is doing in Ukraine, as to are there any implications for what it has its engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So it's a valid question, I think, but I don't think you can quite put Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific in the same category. And at a basic level, um, Ukraine is not covered by any Article 5 alliance obligations. So the United States is under no legal obligation or any alliance obligation to intervene in Ukraine, although there's a very strong moral obligation to do it. But of course, the bigger question for the United States and of course NATO is whether the Russian invasion of Ukraine will spread to Eastern Europe, which has many of NATO allies, right, with Article 5 guarantees. But I don't think you can apply the same, in fact, you can't apply the same kind of dynamic to the Indo-Pacific, right? In the Indo-Pacific, the United States has only four allies: Japan, the Republic of Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines. And it's an entirely different question, even for Japan and the Philippines, who have like territorial disputes with China. Is a question of U.S. involvement, really depending on the specifics of how the situation in those hotspots will pan out. I think another point that I want to add is that if the Asia Pacific is actually looking at Washington in terms of how it carries out its much publicized Indo-Pacific strategy, and from the looks of it, what is happening in Ukraine has not derailed kind of the American push for the Indo-Pacific strategy. Just very briefly, it was highlighted and mentioned when Singapore's Prime Minister Hsien visited Washington last week. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Of the ASEAN countries, Singapore's response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the most resolute, it seemed to me. It levied financial sanctions and export control measures against Moscow. And Singapore criticized Russia's violation of international law. What accounted for Singapore's principled and firm response?
Well, that's an easy one, Ted. I think there was a Singapore politician in past who talked about Singapore being a small boat or sampan, to use the local vernacular, in very turbulent seas. So, as a small state with no former military allies to speak of, international law is the aegis that Singapore uses, right, and depends on for its very survival as a nation state. So, what Singapore's condemnation with Russia is understandable, and I think to the effect that Singapore went on to implement export controls and financial sanctions can be explained by what Singapore Prime Minister Loong talked about: egregious, flagrant kind of violation of international law. And in the Ukraine case, is clear cut. An independent and sovereign country with no provocation whatsoever has been subject to an invasion by another power, and it goes to the very basic fundamentals and core of the United Nations. So, in that sense, it is quite easy to explain. I would also want to contextualize it by saying that Singapore is, there's a phrase in this part of the world where it's said that Singapore and Southeast Asian countries do not want to choose sides between China and the United States. You see that term bandied about in the discourse. But on the Russia-Ukraine issue, Singapore is not taking any sides either, because it's not taking necessarily a pro-American position. It's not taking a Russia position, obviously, but it's taking a position of international law that, given that international law has been violated in the case of Ukraine, Singapore has to condemn it, and Singapore has condemned invasions in the past. And I would point to Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in 1978, as well as the United States invasion of Grenada in 1983. So, so it's not peculiar to any country. It's just a question of international law.
Singaporean Prime Minister Lee recently visited Washington, where he met with President Biden, congressional leaders, and others. Among other topics, the war in Ukraine and US-China relations were discussed. What were the outcomes of Prime Minister Lee's visit?
Well, there's a long list of outcomes, Ted, but I think it was, we have to contextualize it in the sense that the last time Prime Minister Lee visited the United States was in 2019, so that was 3 years ago, so there was a lot of ground to be covered. Some of the agreements that were signed was a Artemis kind of agreement on space cooperation. There was another agreement on infrastructure development. There was a setting up a cybersecurity dialogue with the United States. So these are kind of like the things that happen in a relationship that's very close and long-standing. But I think one of the bigger themes that I gleaned from the Prime Minister's visit is, of course, the issue of Ukraine, which was discussed very extensively in Prime Minister Lee's dialogue at the Council for Foreign Relations last week, and also the question of Sino-American relations, in which the Prime Minister actually repeated a theme that he had first mentioned at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in 2019, which was the restoration of trust, mutual trust between the United States and China, and using that as a basis for some form of functional cooperation despite the many difficulties that there are in the relationship. So I'd be interested to hear from you if there were kind of any American reactions to that general thesis that Prime Minister Lee offered at the Council of Foreign Relations.
In a recent piece that you authored, you mentioned that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will likely cause serious economic problems for Southeast Asia. What particular problems do you see unfolding?
Well, that's a great question, Ted. Just to begin with, again, there are two layers here. The first layer is that Russia's economic involvement in Southeast Asia is not substantial if you compare to, say, China or the United States kind of economic engagement with this part of the world. Russia was ASEAN's 11th biggest trading partner in 2020. A two-way trade amounted only to about $13 billion. And in 2020, Russia invested $63 million dollars into the region, and that's not what you call a very big amount of investment. But I think Southeast Asia being at a critical node in supply chains in the global economy, we will see significant effects on Southeast Asia on two fronts. One is on oil and gas prices, which we are already seeing headed to historical highs, and it's also at petrol pumps across Southeast Asia, if not the rest of the world. We are seeing a jump in petrol prices, and also the war in Ukraine has obviously disrupted air, rail, and sea transportation and has worsened supply chain problems. So, to sum up, it presents a serious economic problem for Southeast Asian countries, which are slowly but surely emerging from the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic.
In a vote at the UN following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, 8 ASEAN member states voted in favor of a resolution condemning Russia's invasion, with Vietnam and Laos abstaining. As you noted in your recent writings, some have criticized ASEAN's response as being insipid. What are some of the reasons behind ASEAN's bland response?
I think those people who criticize ASEAN's reaction for being insipid, um, it's a valid adjective to use, Ted. But if you understand, I only have one thing to say is that ASEAN in the sense that ASEAN cannot take uh, it's it takes a low common denominator in the sense that what is said in the ASEAN statement, whereby the 10 foreign ministers stated that they were deeply concerned and they called on relevant parties to exercise maximum restraint to pursue dialogue and de-escalate tensions. That was like the lowest common denominator given the very wide disparity of views among the ASEAN 10. So just a quick categorization. At one end of the spectrum, you had Singapore, which condemned Russia's invasion, singled out Russia and effected sanctions. Then you have a second rank, which is close to Singapore, but not Singapore's position, which is Indonesia, Brunei, and the Philippines, who have condemned the invasion but did not single out Russia by name. And then you have other countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which have expressed concern about the invasion and called on all concerned parties to de-escalate the conflict. But otherwise, they are, kind of not a very strong view, but an expression of, the need for restraint and a return to dialogue. And of course, at the way at the other end, opposite to Singapore, is Myanmar, which supports the invasion and says that the invasion is kind of demonstrates Russia's great power status. So if you try to do the sums and try to come up with an aggregate view from such disparate positions, Ted, I think you can arrive at kind of figure out why ASEAN arrived at the position that it arrived at. So it is insipid, yes, I wouldn't dispute the adjective, but I'll say that you have to understand what ASEAN is all about.
You noted in a recent piece that Myanmar was the only Southeast Asian country to support Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Why was this? And walk us through a recent history of Myanmar's relations with Russia that would put it in some context.
Yeah, so I mean, Paul, I'm not an expert on Myanmar, but I can offer a few points, Ted. You know that a military coup happened in February last year in Myanmar, and Russia was the first major power to actually recognize the junta as a legitimate government of Myanmar. And of course, you know, we know that both Myanmar and Russia are keen to strengthen relations, especially through Myanmar's acquisitions of more Russian military hardware. Though the junta has admitted that financial sanctions imposed on Russia will complicate the procurement process. Also, we do know that quite differently from the junta's explicit support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the National Unity Government, the Myanmar's government in exile, has actually condemned the invasion. So, it's the junta's view is not a view that is taken by the NUG. So, there's all these complex dynamics that are driving Myanmar's reaction to Russia, but we can all agree that it's like I said earlier, it's way at the other end of the spectrum compared to other ASEAN countries.
Xi Jinping is undoubtedly watching Putin's invasion of Ukraine quite closely. What is he taking away from this, in your view? In the past, you've written about how China employs gray zone tactics and is seeking to build up hybrid warfare capabilities. Does Russia's invasion of Ukraine provide any learning opportunities for China in these areas?
Yeah, I think it depends on which year you're talking about, Ted. Especially on like gray zone tactics. I think we all know that when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, it was through the deployment of little green men who did not wear any official Russian military insignia, and it was quite successful, and it was done. The prelude to the annexation was using a series of gray zone tactics and hybrid warfare. So, if China actually uses that precedent, that example, it could be said that there are valuable lessons to be learned on the implementation of gray zone and hybrid warfare tactics. Fast forward to February and March 2022, and Russia's invasion, of Ukraine on the 24th of February, you could see again the same playbook, but to somewhat profoundly different effects and outcomes. So what I would say is that the Chinese will probably use the Russian invasion and Russia's implementation of gray zone and hybrid warfare tactics as a kind of lessons to be learned and not to be learned from Russia's invasion in Ukraine. I think one point that 2 points that we can note is that in the Ukrainian military, the very skill and quick learning that they have deployed to actually use Western and American military weapons like the javelins and the N-law anti-tank weapons, Stinger anti-air missiles, and even taking over abandoned Russian tanks. And the second point I'd like to note is, of course, the very resilience of the Ukrainian people, their soldiers and paramilitaries. And this would be a lesson that China might have to think very carefully about, because these issues about soldiers resisting an invasion who are quick learning and are resilient and are fighting for their homeland. These are issues that have resonance in Taiwan at the moment. About whether Taiwan can actually replicate the Ukrainian model as and when or if Taiwan decides to invade the island.
This September will mark the 1 year anniversary since AUKUS was developed, that trilateral security partnership between Australia, the UK, and the United States. What is Singapore's views of AUKUS, and more broadly, how has ASEAN reacted?
Yeah, so it's been a year now, so I'm trying to recollect the very details. But I think just as a very rough cut, when AUKUS was actually announced in about September, Indonesia and Malaysia were quite guarded in their responses, and they said that it could spark off a new arms race and affect regional stability. But Singapore, of course, was saying that, I'm kind of rephrasing, Singapore doesn't have any issues as long as it contributes to regional stability. So it wasn't a kind of outright opposition to AUKUS at any rate. If you refer to the 2021 State of Southeast Asian Survey that was published by my institute, the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, you see that among the 1,670 respondents, about 36% of them actually support AUKUS, but the balance of that means what is not the 36%, they chose different categories, as in AUKUS would threaten the non-proliferation treaty regime. AUKUS will lead to an escalating arms race. So in a sense, it captures Southeast Asia again, as a kind of a quite an unhomogeneous kind of entity when it comes to the consideration of an arrangement at AUKUS. So there's a solid, base of respondents who support AUKUS, but on the other hand, about 60+% held an opposite view.
You had mentioned your institution's State of Southeast Asia survey. I know that in February you published the results of this year's survey. What did this year's survey say in terms of Southeast Asia's views towards the U.S.? I know that this year's findings saw China continuing to be regarded as the most influential economic and political power, as with recent years. How do they view the United States?
Yes, very generally, Ted, I think is a mixed picture for the United States. I think the United States made gains, on indicators as it being a kind of a major strategic and political power in the region. It gained some ground vis-a-vis China, but on the overall question of assessing American engagement in Southeast Asia, it kind of went down a little. In 2021, it was about 70%, but in 2022, it was 65, 66. Sorry, it went down quite a lot to about 45%. So it's gone from like 70% to 45%. I'm looking at the figures here right in front of me. But on the other indicators like AUKUS, as I mentioned, which the United States is part of, obviously, there was some measure of support. I think the most encouraging data point that we can see for the United States is on the Quad, because there's a question of do you support the Quad in terms of the Quad being able to deliver on issues like the pandemic or climate change. And I think that there was quite a jump up in support for the Quad. So bottom line is that it was a mixed picture for the United States. It made some gains vis-a-vis China, but I think the Biden administration still has its work cut out for it in terms of trying to, claw back some points among Southeast Asia in the survey.
Well, one final question, as I know that our time is limited. What is the state of COVID in Singapore? I understand that Singapore is trying to work out a live with COVID approach, as are other societies. How are things working out, and do Singaporeans think their government's handling the pandemic has been adequate?
Yeah, I actually haven't looked at the polls, Ted, but if you go on the streets today in Singapore, you go to the restaurants, you go to the cinemas, I'm actually, most Singaporeans are quite encouraged by the fact that they can carry out life pretty much almost like pre-COVID days. Like, one of the key COVID rules is that last year most of us, we had to dine at restaurants at like maximum 5 diners around the table. Now it's been increased to 10. If you do catch COVID, depending on your symptoms, you have to isolate from between 3 to 7 days, depending on your symptoms. And and a lot of Singaporeans are now they call it revenge tourism. They've cooped up for 2 years, and Singaporeans are really avid travelers. So a lot of Singaporeans, including my friends and family, are just planning that next trip. And I think the best indicator of all, given the many thick people-to-people relationships between Singapore and Malaysia, the causeway, which is reportedly the world's busiest land crossing in terms of the human traffic on a daily basis. It has reopened last week, and so there were a lot of Singaporeans making a beeline to Malaysia, and a lot of Malaysians making a beeline for Singapore, and that's kind of heartening to see all the reunions that are happening, and yeah. So I think we are in a good place in COVID. Well, until Ukraine happened, of course, but we we are in a good place. Yeah.
Sounds like the situation is much improved. Thank goodness. Dr. William Choong, thank you for your time. This has been fascinating. It's most kind of you, busy schedule. We appreciate your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted. Thanks for having me.